malpractice suit. We think that's a pretty heavy incentive for doctors to treat their patients right in Canada. We think that in the United States, a lot of these patients are paying like a very low amount for their doctors. Like Harris has said time and time again, some patients go up and only pay $300 for a medical visit, right? Are these patients really going to be that concerned? Are the doctors going to be really concerned? No, because this patient, in all realistic point of view, Madam Speaker, doesn't have enough money to go out and sue them if they screw up. In Canada, it doesn't matter who you're dealing with, what economic class they're from, but if you're a doctor and you really do something wrong to a patient, the government is going to be on your back. And we think the government is a lot better at suing people than people who don't have a lot of money. Ultimately, a charge from the Crown is a lot worse than a charge from some man. And because of that point, we think the liability issue really falls on our side of the House. Lastly, I'm going to reconstruct what Diane brought up. I think most of it still stands. The first thing she talked about was people in jobs. Basically, Diane talked about how there's a lot of issues with jobs in the United States. And essentially, the way Nicole countered this was she said that the average in the United States is better. She said time and time again that the average in the United States is better, but I'm not really sure what she was qualifying this on, right? Life expectancy is higher in Canada. People generally live longer. We think the average in Canada is better. We think for the very elite in the United States it might be a bit better, but for everyone else in Canada, we think the average is better. We think you're out of order. We think that ultimately that in the United States there is this threat of being fired if you are ill, and in Canada that doesn't exist. And we think ultimately the job system is better in Canada than in the US. The next thing we talked about was uninsured. And this was when this great quote came out that I began with, so I guess I'll end with it. Nicole basically said eventually is not good enough. For most people who don't have tons of money in the United States, we would say eventually never comes. We would say they never get treatment because they don't have the money for treatment. In Canada, okay, maybe you have to wait a few days, but that's better than not getting that treatment ever. But because of everything I've talked about today, and because of what Diane's going to come up and boil this case down to, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition speaker. At this time, the first speaker for each side will deliver a 4-minute summary and rebuttal speech. No new information may be introduced during these speeches. We will start with the first opposition speaker, Diane.
Greetings to the members of the House. I'd like to welcome you to that opposition side of the case. What I'm going to be doing for you today, Mr. Speaker, is boiling this debate down into 3 main questions and then just sort of summarizing it for you and giving a last word for side op. So, getting right into the boil down, my first question is, does the U.S. system actually encourage efficiency? A large theme of Nicole's speech was that the U.S. system is more efficient because of the way it works. I'm going to kind of go through it sort of point by point and explain why that's not true. In the U.S., doctors are paid per procedure, which means that they're encouraged to do as many procedures as possible, which may save a few lives that would have sifted through the cracks, but also makes the U.S. entire healthcare system more than twice as expensive. And if that money was used efficiently, we think a lot more lives could be saved. We think doctors are the ones who should decide if a procedure needs to be done, if someone needs to be looked at. Doctors are the ones who should sort of categorize who needs to be looked at first, rather than who can pay to be looked at first. We think this is the most efficient way to do things, and that is the way it's done in Canadian waiting rooms, as my partner explained. What the U.S. system actually encourages, Mr. Speaker, is people who are really rich to go to the emergency room when you stub your toe, because you don't have to wait because you have enough money to bypass the lines. In Canada, we don't think you're going to go to the emergency room for little things, because the emergency room is sort of an unpleasant place if your condition isn't urgent. So really, we think clearly the Canadian system comes out on top when we're talking about efficiency, because if it's urgent, you will get treated, and that's what's important. My second question, Mr. Speaker, is average care in the U.S. actually at par with average care in Canada? My partner did a really good job of refuting what Nicole said about this, but I really think it does need to come out in a boil down, because it is sort of the most important point aside opposition speech, which is that if you're an average citizen, everything that Nicole and Harris have been telling you about this high quality of healthcare does not apply to you. Nicole said a few times that in the U.S. everyone is insured, there's something for everyone depending on your socioeconomic class, and this simply is not true, Mr. Speaker. 40% of people in the U.S. do not have adequate health insurance. 16% don't have any insurance at all. Maybe a small portion of these people chose not to, but I think the majority of people would love to have that safety net and simply can't afford it. In Canada, everyone does get some form of healthcare, and we think that this is a better thing. In Canada, as my partner said, you're guaranteed healthcare eventually. In the U.S., a large portion of the population, almost half, doesn't have access to this high-quality healthcare system at all. My third question, Mr. Speaker, is this whole concept of value of choice, and is this a good idea? Firstly, Mr. Speaker, is it actually a choice? Do people who don't have healthcare choose to not have it, or can they actually not afford it? We on side op would say the latter for obvious reasons. It's common sense to want to insure yourself against a very expensive disease. But my more important point, Mr. Speaker, is even if people do want to make this choice, even if people don't want to pay for their own health insurance, looking at our societal values, is this a choice they should be allowed to make? Or do people have a duty to society, Mr. Speaker, to sort of support the rest of society and that it indirectly benefits them? It's for this reason we require everyone to pay for education. If I don't have any children, I still have to pay for education and support other people's children getting educated, because it benefits society as a whole if society is educated as a whole. In the same way, Mr. Speaker, if society is healthy as a whole, it benefits everyone. And this is why you sort of do have a duty, because it directly benefits you when the people you're working with aren't like dying and bankrupt because of healthcare conditions. And as my partner sort of talked about at the end, it also promotes a level playing field. This whole very idea of the American dream, Mr. Speaker, that anyone can make it no matter who you are, is shattered when you actually examine their healthcare system. Because if I'm sick, Mr. Speaker, I can't go to school, I can't have a job because I have a serious condition and I can't afford to properly treat it. This is not a level playing field, Mr. Speaker. So basically, what has side op told you today? We've told you that our system for the average person is far superior. We've told you our system is more accessible. And we've also told you that this inaccessibility is a really bad thing, because your health becomes an impediment to your success, thus limiting your ability to be equal, your opportunity to be equal. This is discrimination based on health. A nice quote that I read somewhere is that, unless you're Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, you're one illness away from ruin in America. Only in Canada are you given the opportunity to be equal. Only in Canada can you actually live this idea of the American dream. And just to finish up with a quote that Nicole said, quality of healthcare comes before cost. But what I'd like to point out, Mr. Speaker, is that quality only comes ever if you can afford it. Thank you.
We will now hear the proposition's final summary and rebuttal, to be delivered by the first speaker for 4 minutes. I welcome yours.
Thank you. Before I begin the final speech from side government, I first have to clear up 3 misconceptions from side opposition. The first thing they said was that in Canada, if a doctor does something wrong, the government sues them. This is completely ridiculous and false in all claims. What happens in Canada is that if a doctor makes a mistake, you sue them, except what doesn't happen is that the government's on your side. The government is on their side because the government hired the doctors in the first place. So these doctors can get fancy government lawyers, while a regular Canadian has to put up their own legal expenses against the hospitals, against the government. In the United States, it's not like that. The government isn't on the doctor's side helping them out when they make mistakes. Second misconception they gave was that they kept talking about how, you don't really get quality, you don't really get that great care if you can't afford it. And this is probably the biggest misconception in the debate, because in order to get the health care, you don't have to afford it beforehand. They never mentioned it, but there are some medical bankruptcies in the United States, because what happens is they treat you first, they ask questions later. That is why it works. That's the same thing they do with even illegal immigrants. They treat them, even if they're not American citizens. What happens in the United States is that if you have a health problem, they will treat you and bill you after. So it's not like someone who has cancer can't afford to get the treatment. What would happen is he'd get the very best treatment in the entire world. May I remind you that the top 25 hospitals in the world are in the United States, and then he'd have to pay after. And we say, we understand that paying for this type of expensive thing might be hard, and it isn't the best, but at the end of the day, you won't have to wait these 8 weeks for the surgery. You can get it done immediately. Because Lewis said, oh, it's okay, we'd rather wait than get it never. But I mean, first of all, like I've already told you, you don't have to wait in the United States. They will treat you and you will pay later. And secondly, with something like cancer, you can't just wait around 8 weeks, watch TV, look at the sun while it spreads throughout your body. It needs to be dealt with immediately. And that's why the United States is better. And the final